From the low desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona, this is Politics in the Past with Robert Ferguson, brought to you by the Center for American Institutions. And joining me on this audio only podcast is, I was calling him South Dakota Jack for a while and then Cosmopolitan Jack. But maybe now like homeless Jack? Is that the term we should use?
Well, wait, homeless for only a brief period. Couch dweller Jack. Let's put it that way.
Okay, okay. Well, technically, unhoused Jack anyway.
Yeah, just as I'm taking my sabbatical from South Dakota, I'm also taking my sabbatical from having a place to stay. These are exciting moments that we all must have in our lives.
Yeah, well, this is not a cry for help, people. Jack is just for a couple of nights he needs to be he's staying at a friend's house until he goes on the Center for American Institutions trip to Washington D.C.
Yeah, I'm very excited. It's going to be a lot of fun.
And now, Jack, you've been to D.C. several times, I'm sure.
I've actually never been to Washington, D.C. Uh,
Really?
I'm really, really, really super hyped. It's going to be so much fun. I've always wanted to go. You have no idea how many times I've done the Google Street View White House tour.
Okay.
I've read every Wikipedia article about the U.S. Capitol building. I'm so excited.
Well, that's just the sort of intelligence I would expect from somebody who was there on January 6th.
Absolutely, absolutely. This confession isn't being recorded and released in any way, right?
No, 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 not at all.
Okay, excellent. I'm glad to hear it.
Okay, so we wanted to do a bit of a roundup before you went to DC and just make sure that we really haven't touched on the primaries in a while. And in April, there wasn't a whole lot of action, but there have been some things happening, and so it's probably worth just doing a little bit of a touch base. Jack, what's your sense? I want to start in Maine, if that's okay. We've seen since we last chatted, the Democratic primary field for Senate has winnowed to one. Um, what what's your sense on why Graham Platner was able to maneuver Mills into withdrawing?
I've got to say, Rob, this one was a shocker to me. I thought for certain that Janet Mills, was going to win this primary in a walk. In fact, I was so certain that Janet Mills would win the primary and then go ahead and win the general election that I have Janet Mills on my roster for the midterm draft, and that pick isn't looking so good right now. Graham Platner has tapped into a sentiment in the Democratic Party an anti-establishment sentiment that sees longtime office holders, longtime prominent individuals as being of the old guard, as being old school, as not being ready for the demands of the age of Trump, and so has started to reject them in primaries, has started to become critical of them. And in Maine, you saw a manifestation of that. Graham Platner was the ultimate anti-establishment figure, and he dispatched the main insider Democrat in that primary in an upset that not many people saw coming, quite frankly, when the race first began.
No kidding. I mean, Janet Mills is the insider's insider.
Absolutely.
Um, I don't know that there's a person with in any race across the entire country that was probably that was more of an establishment figure than Janet Mills.
She has been in Maine politics for decades. She has been a fixture in Maine Democratic circles for decades. And I mean, that is why ultimately Chuck Schumer, I think, recruited her. Not only is she so prominent, not only is her name ID so sound, not only is her background been so thoroughly checked, both by Democratic and Republican opposition researchers, she was a safe bet. And the Democratic Party has turned away, in many respects, I think, from safe bets towards Graham Platner-esque figures with a, shall we say, more rambunctious personality in political style. And so we'll see how that turns out in the general. You know, Susan Collins is no slouch when it comes to winning competitive elections in years that aren't great for Republicans. And so we'll see how Graham Platner is able to deal with longtime survivor Susan Collins.
Yeah, I don't know that there've been any good polling that's come out since the Janet Mills dropout. Um, and I don't know that the race, that the general race has had a chance to really solidify yet since that news broke. I don't know. Have you seen any polling on this?
I haven't seen any polling on it. I think the general sense is that Platner I think the general sense is that the Democrat might be favored by just an edge, just the tiniest little bit of an edge based on the national environment. But Susan Collins is a formidable opponent in this race. She is going to, she is not going to go quietly into that great good night. And so Graham Platner has his hands full, and we'll see what he's able to do with that. If we could for a moment, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about Chuck Schumer and
Sure.
what Janet Mills dropping out means for Chuck Schumer, because, I mean, Janet Mills was Chuck Schumer's darling. He recruited her, he stood by her, he endorsed her, he helped raise money for her. And for her to not just lose the primary, for her to drop out before the primary occurs, for her to give up is embarrassing for Chuck Schumer. That is an embarrassing turn for Chuck Schumer. I'm wondering what you think about what this indicates for Chuck Schumer's standing within the Democratic Party. What does this tell us about Chuck Schumer's power?
I think it tells us what you were saying earlier about that there's an instinct in the Democratic Party that is that is just flat out rejecting the establishment mainstream figures. Um, and they are going to whoever is willing to fight Trump the hardest.
Mhm.
Um, and that's the what I think has happened is that Democrats broadly have accepted a narrative that Trump is in power and is doing the things that he's doing because Democrats didn't fight hard enough. And the Democrats have basically allowed this to happen by not fighting hard enough. Um, I think there's an argument that can be made that Democrats didn't fight hard enough, but I I mean, given the fact that like Trump faced four prosecutions between 2022 and 2024. I mean, I don't know, maybe there needed to be 12 different prosecutions in some people's minds for for that to have happened. For Democrats to have fought hard enough. I mean, there were
Yeah.
several impeachment attempts in the first term. I mean, I think you could argue, putting my Democrat hat on here for a second, that Democrats have fought Trump stupidly, but I don't know that you can argue that they haven't fought him hard.
I would agree with that. I think that Democrats, and putting aside the prosecutions for a moment, because then that gets into a hazy question of state versus federal and how much politics does or doesn't play a role in each of those various prosecutions, and taking the impeachments, Democrats absolutely made an institutional, a formal case against President Trump. And then they did so again during the January 6th commission. The problem was, and I think the Democrats are seeing this, is nobody was listening really, and nobody really cared because it emanated from formal channels in Congress. It emanated from committee rooms in the floor of the US Senate, and nobody watches C-SPAN, and nobody listens to PBS. At least the people watching C-SPAN and listening to PBS aren't undecided voters. These aren't the people who are determining the outcome of down ballot or presidential elections. And so I think that you're absolutely right to say that the Democrats, or that there's a sense among Democrats that they have fought the Trump administration incorrectly because they have chosen thus far to fight the Trump administration through traditional official channels rather than a more varied approach. That you might see in the future that is represented by figures like Graham Platner.
Yeah, and I think that's the key, and I think that's the narrative that has just generally been picked up by grassroots mainstream by grassroots Democrats, and I just think it's completely wrong.
Yeah.
I think it's an error in perception, it's an error in judgment, and it's a narrative being driven by forces in the Democratic Party that are trying to take control of the Democratic Party,
Well,
right?
and I think it goes even beyond that. I think to a degree it's an era of desperation where Democrats locked out of power are flailing around
Yeah,
for something to do, for something to fight back at. And in lieu of a Republican that they can vote against on a ballot, they are going to take the most or the strongest anti-Trump position that they can take, or what they perceive as the position that will that's the biggest fight against the administration. And in many cases, it is what is perceived as blunt talking, um, yeah, is being real Americans like Graham Platner rather than institutionalists like Janet Mills.
right. And I mean, yeah, but again, and this is the huge I mean, listen, this might turn out for Democrats. I'm not going to suggest
Mhm.
that it isn't. We're in an environment where there's two choices on every ballot, right, in November. And the Trump administration might be so unpopular by November that people just vote the blue ticket, right,
Mhm.
regardless of who's on there. But um, the pro again, I mean, I know we sort of said prosecutions aside here, but like the single biggest misstep of any Democrat between January 7th, 2021 and the day Trump was elected in 2024 was the Alvin Bragg prosecution. It was, you know, it was a mistake. It made it didn't it was a you know it was a charge that an earlier attorney general had chosen not to pursue. It was basically inventing, or it was I can't remember what the phrase was at the time, but it was extending a law into areas it had never been before.
Yeah, you were essentially like cobbling together two
No,
laws to make
right,
it a felony.
right. You decided he was guilty of a felony and you designed the felony to make him guilty of it.
Yeah.
And so when Trump afterwards is going to say, listen, they are corrupt and they are coming at me and they're not following the rule of law, the Alvin Bragg prosecution gave him a leg to stand on for that.
I agree with that to an extent. I think probably the Democrats' biggest mistake during that time period can be summed up in two words, and those are Merrick and Garland. But you're absolutely right to say that prosecution, capturing as it did so much of the anti-Trump attention, um, was a misstep because it focused on such tawdry allegations. You weren't focusing on actually any allegations that were really pertinent to politics or people's lives or the structure of democracy or any of the other talking points that Democrats use.
Well,
These were tawdry things, and so it cheapened, in my opinion, the effect of a prosecution and a conviction.
it was also, are you really going to convict regardless of what you think of a guy? Okay. Whether it's Bill Clinton or Donald Trump, are you really going to convict a president on a procedure crime?
Yeah. Hmm.
Really?
And
Really?
that in we're not, for the record, the first person to say this.
No.
If you ever read Watergate: A New History by Garrett Graff, there's a discussion of the White House prosecutor's office. headed at that point by Leon Jaworski, or the special prosecutor's office, determining whether or not to charge Richard Nixon. This was before there was a Justice Department memo saying that you can't indict a sitting president. And the White House special prosecutor's office knew that they had him on a felony called misprision of a felony, that he had um, known about a crime and hadn't reported it.
Right.
They knew that they could prove him, they had him dead to rights. And they didn't charge him on it because they knew that you couldn't charge a president on a procedural issue. They knew that that wasn't satisfying for anybody.
Right.
And so to like 50 years ago, we have people who thought that out. And yeah, I mean, and I don't, neither of us are saying that what Trump did was necessarily good or something that anybody should be proud of, but there's absolutely an error in that being the crime that you go after.
Yeah. Anyway, I mean, all of this is to say we don't need to relitigate all of these details.
Hmm.
All of this is to relitigate is that all of this is to say that the general Democratic, ordinary grassroots activist um, narrative that has been spun that they didn't go after Trump hard enough and they need people who are going to go after him harder is a narrative being spun from the from from a certain wing of the Democratic Party that is trying to seek control of the Democratic Party. And by the way, like I don't blame them for that. Okay, I don't
Yeah.
blame that wing for that. They're trying to gain institutional power, and that's how you do this. But
Hmm.
the notion that people are accepting it, I mean, and maybe, that's the biggest thing that's being presented. But I think you and I both know that like the institutional mainstream wing of the Democratic Party deserves to be punished and deserves to be punished terribly, but not for that. It
Yeah.
deserves to be punished for lying about Joe Biden. It deserves to be punished for the ridiculous circumstances that allowed a terrible Kamala Harris campaign in November,
Hmm.
in the fall of 2024. And it deserves to be punished for not being able to figure out a way to, um, it among an electorate that they should be doing relatively well with, to completely lose a plot. Gossip deserves to be punished for, not for not fighting Donald Trump hard enough, because it did fight Donald Trump hard. It just fought him stupidly.
Yeah. It is, I mean, there's nothing more, there's no more classic move of Democrats than to hate the Democratic Party. And that's in the DNA. There, there's the brilliant Simpsons line, "We hate life and ourselves, we can't govern." And it's absolutely true of the Democratic Party. Um,
That is, by the way, one of the great cutaway gags
mhm.
in the.
It's it's the great, I think it's the probably great cutaway gag in The Simpsons.
Uh,
Um,
there's
I
two
mean,
others, but that's certainly the most appropriate one we can. Maybe the best political one. All right. Anyway, so we'll
anyways,
talk about that. But I mean, why this matters is that we're. And again, none of it might end up mattering in Maine in November or anywhere else in November, because in the end, what might happen is that people are just so frustrated with the Republicans that they end up voting blue, no matter who is the candidate. Um, and so whether it was Graham Platner or Janet Mills, it doesn't matter. Although am I am really confident about this, that Graham Platner might win in November. But if Graham Platner wins in November, Janet Mills would have won by a bigger margin.
I agree with that. And I don't just say that because I had her on my roster and I want to defend that choice. Um, she is like, for every voter, there's a tendency amongst Democrats or the left online, prominent activist members of the left, to argue that actually further left candidates in the Democratic Party are more electable because they excite and activate young voters, or voters who are to the left who otherwise stay home because they feel bored about mainstream Democrats. And that narrative's ridiculous.
It's
Um,
I mean, to be honest, it's also from the left, but
yeah. Um, and so like and that's the argument that these folks make about Graham Platner is perhaps he'll lose some moderates who are turned off by some of his more blunt or extreme rhetoric, but he'll turn out all of these lefties in Maine who would have stayed home because they find Janet Mills to be more just a milquetoast candidate. To whom I ask, how many leftists are there in the state of Maine? Like
well,
truly.
here's the no, no, no. I mean, so here's what it comes down to. I mean, Maine politics, as you know, we've discussed at earlier times, is south of Highway 1 against the 90, the area between 95 and 1,
Mm-hmm.
right? South of 2 and 1, maybe, depending on where you are in Maine, but 95 works effectively well if you look at a map. And south of 1 or towards the coast of 1 is where you've got all the hippies, basically. The affluent hippies live there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Graham Plattner, that's his base.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
That's
think we've previously described it as being Stars Hollow-esque.
Stars Hollow-esque. Yeah, that's exactly how we described it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've got so you've got that strip of Maine that's tourist villages, fishing coves, that kind of thing, that like 30 years ago was highly working class, but now is just really affluent. It just larks
Mm-hmm.
working class. And they think they're working, yeah, because that was part of the Stars Hollow rappers, right? They think they're
Yeah.
working class, but really they're not. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and then you've got the area between 95 and 1, kind of south of 95 and north of 1, which is where the cities are. And that's where the professional class lives,
Yeah.
right? Bangor, Augusta, Portland are in them. Um, and that's Janet Mills territory. That was Janet, right? And that's frankly Susan Collins territory.
Yeah. These days it is.
Well, it's always been like that's where you've got the Susan Collins voters and the Janet Mills voters, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, then again, then north of 95 is the old lumber towns, right? And that still is very working class.
Yeah.
And that what Plattner needs to do is he needs to run a pincer movement. He needs to take south of 1 and then he needs to take north of 95. And he needs to run a pincer movement against the professional areas, right? Against Janet Mills country or Susan Collins country. And so what's interesting about Mills dropping out is now it's the profession is that if Susan Collins can capture that professional corridor, that's where the population base is. She'll win this election. And
Mm-hmm.
so Plattner has to convince the Janet Mills voters in that central area that Susan Collins, by not objecting to Trump enough, has essentially lost all credibility and she shouldn't be returned. And, and Graham Plattner, this, leftist grenade throwing, former SS tattoo wearing guy should be
Yeah.
returned because he'll be more actively anti-Trump. That's the argument. That's what he has to make, right? But it has to be that pincer movement. He needs to win everything south of 1, and he needs to win those, frankly, MAGA voting communities north of 95. But
Yeah.
those MAGA voting communities north of 95 don't like Susan Collins,
Yeah.
right? Because she's too establishment for them. So he might be able to get those voters. But
And
that's like
and in that
it's
sense,
dicey.
yeah, in that sense, like this election, to a great degree, I think, is out of Graham Plattner's hands because the one person who can most effectively drive home the message that Susan Collins isn't doing enough to stand up to Trump to those professional voters isn't Graham Plattner. It's Donald Trump. And whatever
Yeah.
Donald Trump does or doesn't do in the weeks and
Mhm.
months before the election, whatever ammunition, to put it more precisely, that Donald Trump does or doesn't give Graham Plattner before the election, I think is what's going to decide that. If there is a memory fresh in those professional voters' minds of Susan Collins not standing up to Trump on one issue or another that Graham Plattner can point to right before the election, if that notion is salient, because Trump made it salient, then I think Graham Platner wins. Otherwise, like the examples that Graham Platner will point to are so far in the past that, our brains, addled as they are with the 24-hour news cycle and social media and the heat, um, will be forgotten.
But you know what? Here's the argument Susan Collins has to make. This is the argument, right? Is that and again, I am operating, this is purely I'm trying to put on my Maine Politico cap here, which is not easy. I don't live in Maine. I've never spent much time there. So I'm purely
Mm-hmm.
I'm going off the notion that Susan Collins has managed to continue to win Maine, which is a very Democratic state, because she continues to, she's a Republican that center left voters trust, right?
Yeah.
That's the premise I'm operating off of here. But that could be a wildly off kilter, um, premise. So feel free to criticize it, whatever. But what Susan Collins is going to tell those Democratic voters is that, or those centrist voters, is that you don't think that I've stood up to Trump enough. I'm one of the very few reasons you still have a filibuster in the Senate.
This is a good
Because
point.
Susan Collins is one of those Republican stalwarts who supports the filibuster. And so, the that has to be the argument. If Susan Collins can say, if you elect Platner, that's one Senate seat closer to you losing the filibuster.
That's a good point. And I have long disagreed with folks who I normally agree with on politically. I support the filibuster. Um, I wonder again. Like I agree that that is a good argument that Susan Collins can make. I just wonder around election day whether that sort of technical argument about Senate procedure will be outweighed by whatever Donald Trump says on Truth Social.
You know what? It depends on Susan Collins's campaign. That's in Susan Collins's court.
That
She
is in
has to make
Susan
that way.
Collins's court.
She has
And
to make that way.
she'll
If
have
she
plenty of money to make that argument.
she'll have plenty of money to make that argument. And you know what? If for whatever reason she if she can't make that argument, that's such a strong argument for what I assume is the swing votes in Maine. If she can't make that effectively, she deserves to lose.
Yes, absolutely. Like if it is such a slam dunk argument with those voters, um, and it plays
What
into,
I perceive those voters to be, right?
yeah. Well, because it goes to stability. Fundamentally, what I think not only those voters, but moderate voters across America want, is a sense of stability in what they dislike, both about Trump and about leftist Democrats in equal measure, is the sense that they are disturbing the natural equilibrium of America, or of American politics. And so that argument appeals to exactly that sense, and in that sense is a anti-Trump argument, because it is saying if you want to restore this political equilibrium, then you must vote for me, not Platner. And so in that sense, I think it's a very strong argument.
Yeah, and the other thing is that Susan Collins can say, listen, it's because of me that the filibuster, people like me and very few others, that the
Hmm.
filibuster is still in place. If
Yeah.
you vote for Platner, right, you lose somebody who supports the filibuster in the Republican caucus, meaning that let's assume, I mean, the map still looks pretty good for Republicans to hold the Senate. So we assume, you lose Susan Collins out of that Senate caucus. I mean, that's, one step closer to losing the filibuster when the Republicans control the Senate. Um, and she could easily point to, and Mr. Platner, would you support the filibuster if the shoe was on the other foot? Because you know the answer to that, because Platner wouldn't support the filibuster.
And probably, I guess I haven't checked this. I'm certain he has said that he doesn't support the filibuster.
I hadn't checked it either.
Hmm.
I know you can find a position. I know you can find him saying that at some
Yeah.
point in the past. He may have
Mm-hmm.
deleted it, but I know you can find that
Yeah, deleted it along
because
with all
guys
manner
like
of other
this
things.
don't right because don't guys like this think like that,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
That's how people like Graham Plattner think. And anyway, so we've come at Graham Plattner from a few different angles. We did that before several months ago, and now we're doing it again. You and I really don't like Graham Plattner, do we?
You and I, like, we do not like Graham Plattner to a degree. Like Rob and I, for the listeners at home, we don't actually agree on. I mean, we agree on sort of general political principles, but when it comes to many candidates and specific issues, we oftentimes find ourselves in a disagreement. Both of us are just extremely, or pardon me, extremely disappointed and annoyed with like the Graham Plattnerification of politics. Would you say that that's
Just
sort of an
because,
accurate statement?
yeah, I do because and Graham Plattner of all of them bothers me the most because you know what? Like, I give me an honest grifter on some level,
Mm-hmm.
you know. Uh,
Yeah, like in
Graham
Edwin
Plattner,
Edwards, there was an honesty there.
yeah, there's just he's he's just such a I, I don't know. I mean, the notion that he's some authentic oyster farmer is pathetic. Like it's just he's not. Um, and he just like I don't believe for a second. I know he hates talking about the tattoo, and the left gets really upset when you talk about the tattoo. But I'm sorry that the tattoo reflects a lack of judgment at the very
Mm-hmm.
least. Um. Anyway, Jack seems to have I've lost Jack here for a second, so I'm gonna filibuster and hope that he can
Rob,
join
I
me.
lost you.
But anyway, it's nice that sometimes when Jack and I can fully agree on something because as Jack was mentioning, we actually disagree on quite a bit.
Rob,
Um, so anyway, hopefully he can get back in here. But anyway, we've talked a little bit about Graham Plattner. Probably don't need to say anything more about Graham Plattner in Maine. Susan Collins is for Susan Collins to run against Graham Plattner, it's a very different race than if she was running against Janet Mills. And so I think it's going to be really interesting. We'll see how it turns out. Again, we don't try not to get particularly let our opinions on individual candidates come out that often, but for whatever reason, Fran Plattner causes it with Jack and I. Um, and anyway, it's a we'll see. We're gonna see how that campaign turns out. Again, I really think. Um, sorry, let me just. Oh, there you are, Jack.
oh, there you are, John. All right, I'm back.
Good. All right. I was beginning to run out of the ability to filibuster there. Anyway, I'd finished I'd finished I put a bow on Graham Plattner for us so we can move to Texas.
All right, let's do it.
Nothing, Maine and Texas, we seem to do them together. But they're just they're kind of on a similar schedule, so I guess that's why.
Yeah.
Um, well, no, actually, not a similar schedule. It's just I think they're both equally interesting, and the Senate races are equally interesting. So,
They're equally interesting, but they're equally interesting on like different sides of the aisle. I think
yeah,
that they make a nice pairing in that way.
they do,
Yeah.
they do. All right, so moving to a runoff between Cornyn and Paxton. Um, Talarico seems to be every poll I'm seeing has Talarico up 6 or 7 points over each of them. That
That's
surprises me.
shocking. I absolutely I expected Talarico to be polling above Ken Paxton, but to see Tallarico consistently polling by respectable margins ahead of John Cornyn is a shocker, and really takes the wind out of John Cornyn's electability argument sails.
Does.
Like, yeah, like John Cornyn can wander around Texas and say Ken Paxton will cost us the Senate seat all day long, but every poll that comes out that shows James Tallarico beating John Cornyn brings us that much closer to a Ken Paxton nominee.
Yeah, I think that's true. And also, while the voters in Maine the Democratic voters in Maine have clearly shown enough support to the bomb throwing candidate of the two Democrats. In Texas, the opposite happened. And
Yeah.
whatever one might think of James Tallarico, you and I both agreed that of the two of them, he was probably more electable than Crockett. And
Yes.
he that seems to be showing to be the case now. Now, here's the thing. Texas voters, Texans are currently enduring a neither Cornyn and Paxton are going to be doing as badly as they possibly could be doing against Tallarico right now.
Yes.
And that's just a consequence of the fact that Cornyn and Paxton are attacking each other constantly. And so
Mhm.
they can't look good. And nobody's treating people have basically forgotten Tallarico exists,
Yeah.
which is good for Tallarico. He's not spending any money right
Oh, like this is springtime in the south of France for James Tallarico right now. And I agree that like these are probably the peak of his polling numbers.
Yes.
But like the ability to build his campaign war chest, he has had a number of fantastic fundraising months. Well, Ken Paxton and John Cornyn, whichever one of them wins that runoff, is going to come out with a extremely depleted bank account. The that like that James Tallarico can essentially sit and lie in wait for whichever opponent comes out of the runoff gives him such an advantage.
Yeah, and I mean, it really does speak to the real disadvantage that this is for Cornyn, and I think it's worse for Cornyn than it is for Paxton, um,
Hmm.
because Cornyn's the argument, as you said, is it's not just an electability thing. I mean, it is, but it's if Cornyn has basically been making this argument to Republican stakeholders, which is that if um if you pick me, you're not going to have to spend much money in November to hold the seat.
Yeah.
And I just, you know what? It doesn't matter who wins this Republican race. They're going to need to spend a whack load of money to beat Tallarico.
Yeah. This race is looking to be far more competitive than I think either of us thought it was going to be going into November. I like James Tallarico has been an excellent candidate thus far. Um, and I honestly I am shocked that President Trump did not offer an endorsement in this race. I am shocked he did not offer an endorsement in this race.
I'm not. I'm not.
Oh, what? Okay.
I'm not. He was going to. It was all lined up for him to endorse Cornyn. I think we both understand that.
Yeah.
But I think it became clear that didn't have enough support to do that. I think there are too many. He realized that there's too many Republicans in Texas who don't like John Cornyn and are excited by Paxton, and that he couldn't do it. He couldn't make that endorsement. Um, and I know he was being pulled in two directions, and he just thought it was safer to not make any decision at all. And by the way, Wesley Hunt has not made an endorsement either. And Wesley Hunt was the Republican who finished third in the primary. And
Hmm.
so, in some ways, this is a competition for Wesley Hunt voters. And they maybe unsurprisingly have gravitated towards Paxton, but it's a because Wesley Hunt's pretty pretty doctrinaire Trumpy Republican as opposed to John Cornyn, who's sort of more the George W. Bush Republican. Um, but it's I honestly think Trump probably wisely from his own perspective declined to make that endorsement.
I don't know. I think it was, I agree with you in the short term that it was wise for Trump in that a loss on his record. And you're absolutely right to say that, like, even with a Trump endorsement, John Cornyn was not a surefire thing. But I think in the long run, the fact that Republicans are going to have to spend millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars on the Senate race if Ken Paxton gets the nomination just to barely hold the seat, and that those millions of dollars could have gone to Maine or North Carolina or Ohio or Alaska, or wherever, is going to cause just so much resentment against Donald Trump in the Republican
Yeah,
Party. I don't, not that like,
yeah, and
and there have been news stories that have come out indicating that Donald Trump doesn't have a huge interest in the midterm elections. And so I find that dynamic to be really fascinating. All of these candidates clamoring for Trump's endorsement for an election that Trump doesn't care about really deeply. And certainly right now he's focused on Iran. There's plenty on his plate. Um, but I wonder in the long run if that doesn't come back around and become an ankle on Trump's, or a weight on Trump's ankles.
yeah, it could be. I mean, so just going back to your point on, that Talarico's proven to be a good candidate. I mean, lots of people are will really dislike James Talarico, and the thing, and and he certainly has some things in his past, saying some things that could alienate evangelical voters. That could alienate a whole bunch of people who otherwise might be attracted to voting for him. But here's why Talarico is doing the things he needs to do by being just not by being at least like vanilla in this race. He is going to force Republicans to spend money that they'd want to spend elsewhere to
Hmm.
beat him.
Yeah.
And that's what he's doing that's effective. He might lose. I still think he loses in November. I'm sorry, I still think he loses in November. But the Republicans are going to have to spend money to win this race. And as you and I brought up many times, Texas is the most expensive place to run a campaign because of all of the different media markets. Um, Republicans are going to have to spend so much money there that they would way rather spend in Maine,
Yeah.
whether Cornyn or Paxton's a candidate. And for that purpose, for that alone, James Talarico has done his job in a way that, by the way, people make fun of Beto O'Rourke
Yeah.
in
I was
2018,
I was just about to say
and
this.
they should make fun of Beto O'Rourke because he brought in a lot of Democrat. The key is to not waste too many Democrat dollars in this race. That's the real key. Beto probably wasted a lot of Democrat dollars that could have gone elsewhere, but he also forced Ted Cruz to spend a lot more than he wanted to spend,
Yeah.
than Republicans wanted him to spend. And so, the key is to and maybe the Democrats have learned their lesson from 2018, but to not, you know, to be a little more efficient in this. But Republicans are going to have to spend a lot of money there, and you and I both know it's been a hard year for Republicans to raise money.
Yeah.
So,
I wonder what you think if Ted Cruz was the Republican candidate in this race instead of either Ken Paxton or John Cornyn. Hypothetically, do you think James Talarico would be do you think James Talarico would be polling ahead against Ted Cruz?
he might be. I don't know about that. Here's one thing I do know, and this is, I think, part of Beto's problem in 2018, is that I think your average national Democratic voter hates Ted Cruz more than they hate John Cornyn or Ken Paxton.
Yeah.
And
If
so
only
it's
because they know Ted Cruz's name far
precisely,
more than that. Yeah.
precisely. And so there's your average CNN, MSNBC Democrat, was motivated to send money to the Beto O'Rourke campaign to beat a guy they really, really hate. Um, Now I think a lot of voters hate Ken Paxton, but I don't think, and you and I know who Ken Paxton is. I honestly don't think your average
Yeah.
Democratic voter or donor in the country knows who Ken Paxton is,
Yeah.
at least today. And so they might. learn to hate Ken Paxton by November, your average Democratic voter, to the same degree that they hate Ted Cruz, but I don't think they do. So why I think that matters is that I don't think Tallarico is just going to get that massive influx of money that could have gone to other people in the
Hmm.
Democratic Party. Um, he's going to be the money that he brings in is going to be more um, is going to be more sensible than I think the flood of money that went Beto's way because people really wanted to beat Ted Cruz.
Yeah, I think
So
that
anyway, that's my sense.
yeah.
What's your sense? What's your sense?
I agree with that. I think that with Ted Cruz, the hate of like as you said, the MSNBC or MS Now, as it's referred to these days, Democrat, their hate for Ted Cruz is really marinated over the past several years in a way that it just hasn't for Ken Paxton. And so I agree that like I actually think that James Tallarico would probably be polling better against Ted Cruz than he would be against either Paxton or Cornyn, certainly against Cornyn. Um, but this is going to be a fascinating
No,
race to watch.
I think Ted Cruz wipes the floor with Tallarico.
Oh, I disagree with that. I
And
think Tallarico probably beats Ted Cruz in a general. And of course we'll
no, you know
never have an
why?
opportunity to why is that?
Cruz is a pastor.
Oh,
And Tallarico's his biggest weakness is his embrace of left-wing theology.
actually I see
And
that actually as his
Cruz,
greatest strength.
and in some places, yes, not in Texas.
Oh,
And Ted Cruz would make him pay for it in a way that neither Paxton nor Cornyn can, who are more conventional. Paxton is not conventional, but in some ways he is more conventional than Ted Cruz in the sense that he's a kind of a business law. He's a businessman, right? He's
yeah,
out of that wing of the party and not the true evangelical wing.
yeah. And I see that point. And there's absolutely like for evangelical voters, Tallarico's theology is poison, is noxious. But I wonder if there isn't, particularly amongst Catholics, and in Texas, Catholics are a significant
Look,
portion
Jack,
of the
I was
voting
about to make a
population.
really compelling point,
If there
really
isn't
wrong
a,
compelling point, but it was going to be a compelling point. But he was wrong. So anyway, that's again, sorry, lose Jack. I mean, this is what happens when you set up a podcast with a homeless guy, is that there's just like trying to get the reception when he's out on the streets. He's probably underneath an overpass somewhere trying to hijack Wi-Fi from the nearest library or something in order to make this work. I mean, it's really tough. You really feel for the guy. I mean, some of these overpasses are pretty brutal when you go. I mean, it's getting hot out. I worry about Jack. But anyway, so I'll let Jack have a second and try to get back in here. But um, the key point in Texas is that the actually in the primary, and we haven't even gotten to the actual primary yet. Um, Paxton seems to have a very narrow lead over Cornyn, a very narrow lead. And,
I'm back.
so Jack, welcome back. I know I've been telling the people that this is what happens when you set up a podcast discussion with a homeless guy. The reception goes in, and you're trying to pirate the reception from the nearest library or underneath an overpass
Yeah.
somewhere. You're
Unfortunately,
trying
this
to dodge all the
Arby's
people
has
who are
sort of
general.
intermittent internet. Yeah. Yeah. The point that I was making is that amongst evangelical voters, Tallarico's theology is not popular, but amongst Catholic voters, and in Texas there are many Catholic voters, I think that Tallarico's theology has a certain appeal to it today because it aligns so strikingly with that of the Pope. And as the Pope gets more and more involved in American politics, and is perceived to be more and more of an anti-Trump figure, from a theological standpoint, I wonder if Tallarico, despite the fact that he is not Catholic, the apparent similar.
I think we lost Jack again. This is again, I mean, this Arby's is just really struggling. Uh, I hear you, Jack, but here's the problem. I think people want the Pope to be left wing, but he's just not left wing. Um, People want him to be this anti-Trump figure, and he's just not an anti-Trump figure, I don't think. I mean, maybe in some ways he is. Catholics certainly, there's a major group of Catholics who really disagree, and there's a real disagreement between Catholics and many evangelical, especially more right-wing evangelical spaces over the issue of immigration. But I don't know that there's the same kind of disagreement on LGBTQ issues. And so that's where Tallarico's going to get hit. It's not necessarily his liberal views on immigration, I don't think. But I could be wrong on that. But anyway, again, what I think is more, I mean, I think more relevant right now is not so much November, but the actual race between Cornyn and Paxton. I think Paxton has most polling that I've seen as Paxton with a 2 or 3 point lead, and the early voting starts here in a couple of weeks. I and there's enough undecideds. It's I think it's really too close to call, which is probably why so much money is being spent on this race, and these two guys are hitting each other over the head so much. It also, I mean, in a way, kind of again mirrors the Janet Mills Graham Platner debate or contest, because it is the two wings that exist of the Republican Party in Texas, kind of personified in that, you've got Paxton, who really is kind of the MAGA, um, more stridently anti-Democrat figure, versus Cornyn, who's sort of made a career of being an insider, able to work both sides of the aisle to some degree. And it's going to be interesting to see if who wins. It's not a perfect facsimile. I don't think Platner and Paxton are that similar, frankly. Um, Paxton is frankly a more known quantity. Paxton has a lot of ethical and legal baggage. We should be clear about that, but I don't think he's the same kind of he doesn't aggravate me, at least in the same way that Platner aggravates me. It's he actually has a record that he can stand on. Whether you like that record or not is, people are free to vote on it. Um, it's a anyway, so I'll be curious to see how it all shakes out in the next few weeks. Um, well, I don't think we're gonna get Jack back again. He's these the Wi-Fi that he's been trying to pirate, probably off of some homeless guy's hotspot, is becoming too difficult. So I'm gonna let him go. Thank you very much for joining. I know this kind of turned into a bit of a fractured discussion, but hopefully it was still of value. And we wish Jack the best of luck in Washington, D.C. And hopefully he gets better internet there. Anyway, thank you very much. Take care.